Okay, we're at 5 past the hour, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the Evernym webinar on digital guardianship, how we will make self-sovereign identity work for all. I'm very pleased to be here with you. So the two of us that are going to present today here, myself, I'm Chief Trust Officer at Evernym, and also one of the trustees of the Sovereign Foundation, where I chair the Sovereign Governance Framework Working Group. And that is where we have hosted for the last year the Guardianship Task Force. I want to say right here at the outset that what you're going to hear about is the work of a task force that's been working for an entire year. There's at least a dozen major contributors to that task force, including the chairs this past year, Nikki Hickman in the UK, and Peter Simpson of iRespond, who's both in Seattle and also in Myanmar and Thailand, where you'll hear more about his work later. So I want to acknowledge all of them. One of the major contributors to that task force is Evernem's Chief Architect, Daniel Hardman. So he's here together with me to give this webinar today. Daniel, a few words? We don't have audio for you. There you go.
Hey there. Glad to meet you and talk about this important topic. I'm excited. I think there's been some important progress made in the communities that we work in. And I think there's lots of goodness that can come from all of us starting to implement guardianship features in our particular projects.
Excellent. And we will dive down into that. So what we're going to cover here today, obviously explaining what guardianship is and why we need it. Daniel will then go into some of the details about how it works, what goes into guardianship credentials, and how guardians can prove that they have those credentials. And then we'll talk about the very important topic of governance of guardianship and how you deal with the risks of the digital dependency. And then we'll give you some very real examples of how it's being used today. A number of our attendees are in fact active on that task force and are working on projects implementing guardianship, and they will be available for the Q&A period that we'll have at the end. So we want to allow plenty of time for Q&A. Now, speaking of that, in this webinar setup, it's you'll see a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, or at the top. I'm not sure which way it appears, but anytime you have a question, we're gonna wait on questions until the end of the presentation, but don't wait to put your questions in. As soon as you have a question, even right now, it's just like, I got the one thing I want to know about guardianship. Just hit that Q&A question, and that way we'll have them all queued up for when we're finished, and we'll go into the Q&A period, and then just keep adding questions whenever you have one. And we'll do our best to try to get to all of them, although we're going to limit the overall time to an hour for this. All right, with that, let's dive into what is digital guardianship. So with self-sovereign identity as a whole, guardianship plays a very, very special role, because it is what happens when a dependent, anyone who can't control their identity themselves, must entrust another individual organization to do that for them. And it is a critical concept. I like to point out, it's actually the second principle in the sovereign governance framework. The first core principle is the right to self-sovereign identity. The second is the right to guardianship. So it has become one of the very hottest areas in research and development of SSI, because folks recognize that we won't be successful with SSI infrastructure for planet Earth, internet-wide, without attending to this problem and making sure that we have robust solutions for guardianship. A major workshop was held in Toronto 2 weeks ago, sponsored by Secours, that you'll hear more about later in the webinar. I gave a keynote there, and it was a tremendous. It was all about guardianship and as applied to dementia, a growing problem that, again, you'll hear more about. So that's why we've also just finished several major deliverables from the Guardianship task force and formed the new Guardianship working group, and we'll talk about all that at the conclusion of the webinar. So why is this need as large as it is? It's again, to reinforce, if the very core idea of SSI is individuals managing their own identity data, not having to depend on third-party identity providers to do that, and having it be portable for life and beyond, then what do you do about anyone who lacks the hardware connectivity capacity to do that? If you've got a solution that works for everyone who is connected and has those devices, we could actually make the digital divide worse with self-sovereignty identity infrastructure if we don't address the issue of digital guardianship. Now, just to make sure that's clear how large that is, we're still, as many people as connected on this planet, we may be past the halfway point, but there's still 3 billion that don't have access to the internet today. We need digital guardianship for the whole portion of our population that are children and are not in a position to, that need real world guardianship in many cases. We, of course, one of the most important populations is refugees, that where traditional forms of identity either don't work or in some cases have actually been weaponized and used against individuals. And then this workshop tremendously educated me as to just how large and growing the problem of dementia is, and how critical a role that guardianship can play in dealing with this growing problem. So to sum it up, all of us who are in a position to be on webinars like this and have the devices, have the connectivity, we can take full advantage of SSI, but half the world's population needs that help. And that is the whole purpose of digital guardianship and why it's so important in the development of SSI infrastructure. Now, we want to be very specific in this webinar, where Evernym as a company produces, SSI products and services for the whole market, to make sure that it's clear that digital guardianship is just one of 3 types of what we call identity control relationships that exist and are made possible, and ideally are going to be made much easier, very natural things in SSI infrastructure. The most common type of that relationship is called delegation. It's where one SSI identity holder is able to say, hey, I want to delegate a responsibility to another one, okay? Classic example, of course, any organization does this. This is basically the purpose of organizations, is to have a hierarchy or network of delegated responsibility that, a CEO will delegate to a human resources officer, who will delegate to an accountant within that department. That form of delegation performed with verifiable credentials is just going to be classic endemic. There's almost no workflow in the organizational use of self-sovereign identity that will not involve delegation. Delegation is different than guardianship, and the critical difference is, when you have delegation, you have 2 parties that are both self-sovereign, and one can accept a delegation credential from the other. In guardianship, the dependent, by definition, in that specific context and relationship, is not in a position to accept digital credentials to run a digital wallet. So the guardian is taking on that responsibility. The third thing we'll contrast it with is what we call controllership. That's when the entity with a self-sovereign identity is a thing, a digital thing, whether it's a device or a virtual thing, like a file. Those all have a control relationship, but they always have a thing controller, some other self-sovereign entity, be it a person or organization, that is controlling that thing. And so they're all 3 control relationships, but guardianship is special because it's the one where another human being is depending on the guardian for control of their digital wallet and to represent them in the digital world. Now, to dive deeper into how this works, Daniel is going to represent some of the very fine work that he has contributed to the Guardianship Working Group.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about this. I hope we've picked about the right level of detail here. If we don't go deep enough, or if I assume something that I maybe haven't explained well enough, please do use the Q&A later. And I also want to say that there are a lot of other smart people, including some on this call, who have contributed to the technical aspects of what I'm about to say. So this isn't just me, but rather the Guardianship Task Force ideas that I'm trying to share. Theoretically, it should be easy enough to model guardianship. And in fact, when we talk about it in casual terms, we often kind of convey a very simple mental model. Well, the parent is the guardian of the child. That sounds pretty easy to understand. And then we extend that same kind of simple mental model and say, well, a caretaker can be a guardian, or an organization can be a guardian. And that's fine as a simplification, but in fact, the world gets a little bit muddier. There are plenty of situations where there are disputes about guardianship. And so here we're kind of showing a diagram where a child is in the middle and there's a bunch of adults arguing. The key thing to know here is none of the adults that are arguing are necessarily making statements that are incorrect. So there's conflicting realities and they're all true. So the particular situation that's kind of shown in the script at the right is one where an NGO in a refugee camp is asserting guardianship over a child, but there's a parent present, and maybe there's a second parent, and there's an argument between the parents about which parent is really in charge and how the rights of the parents relate to the rights of the refugee camp to be the guardian, and maybe the court has to get involved, some legal jurisdiction representative saying, no, we've arbitrated between this already. The point being that guardianship actually becomes quite messy, and whatever we do with the technology needs to accommodate the subtleties, the nuances, and the mess. We can't just pretend it doesn't exist, or else we'll just create a world where the technology is theoretically helpful but doesn't have any practical value. It's also important to recognize that even when you have guardians that completely get along and have very clear mandates, they might have different roles. You could have a parent who's the normal guardian of a child who needs to appoint a grandparent to be the guardian for a period of time while they are in surgery or traveling out of the country or whatever the circumstances might be. And maybe the parent is comfortable having that grandparent do certain guardian things, but not all guardian things. You could have cases where one child is the guardian of their adult parent with dementia with respect to medical, but not with respect to legal and financial. Maybe that's a different child. So guardians can have different roles, and the roles need to be spelled out, and they need to be known to other parties who interact with those guardians in the system. One of the key principles that emerges from this kind of realization is that we need a way to describe constraints that kind of govern how the guardians operate. And there's a big, busy list of constraints here. You don't need to read all the details, but I hope in glancing at it, the impression that you get is, wow, yeah, there's a lot of different kinds of constraints that might be relevant. There are constraints in the example I gave of a parent going out of the country and appointing a grandparent being a guardian. There's kind of circumstances, right? You're the guardian of my child as long as I'm out of the country. So that means that 3 years later, when the parent is back in the country and doing normal things, the grandparent can't assert guardianship privileges. all of these kinds of constraints need to be taken into account by the technology that we build. And maybe there's more. This is not necessarily an exhaustive list. So the way that we maybe address the expression of these constraints, and that we prove to parties that somebody does have a legitimate guardianship status, and explain how that status came to be and how it operates, is that we use verifiable credentials. And I was kind of joking with Drummond the other day that we kind of made a catchphrase out of the notion that there's an app for that. Well, there's a credential for that. There's a credential for guardianship. But what goes into that credential? There's a number of kind of key ingredients in the recipe. The credential has to include some attributes that correctly identify which dependent we're talking about. Proving that you're a guardian in the abstract is useless. You have to prove that you're a guardian of a particular person, and knowing what that particular person is in terms of the attributes they manifest. This is a person who is 7 years old. She is female. Her name is X. She has a birthmark on her shoulder. You know, whatever those attributes are, we need to be able to compare them to a person that we're observing in real life and know that we're talking about the same person. So attributes. We also need to know exactly what privileges are held by the guardian, and what constraints govern how the guardian operates. Privileges and constraints are not the same idea. They're not opposite sides of the same coin either. There's a little bit of subtle difference in the semantics of how they work, but obviously kind of attack the same thing. Both of them let us know what's valid behavior. And then we need to know what rationale is behind the guardianship. This is so that we can adjudicate, because sometimes human judgment must be used. In the example that we gave earlier, where there's a bunch of adults arguing and all the adults are saying true statements, the way that you decide whether the father or the mother or a grandparent or the refugee camp should exercise their guardian privileges in a given context is to understand who has the strongest rationale or basis for being a guardian or asserting a given privilege. That's a human decision. So anyway, this is a dump of some data that might go in a guardianship credential. It's not necessarily how a guardianship credential would be shown in a mobile app or a tablet or something like that. And it's not necessarily a file format, but it just kind of represents some pieces of data that might all go inside a guardianship credential. So let me show you how the things I talked about in the previous slide actually manifest. There's a section of this data that includes attributes to identify the dependent. And there's a section that includes what are the privileges of the guardian. There's also a section that describes constraints on how the guardian's privileges operate. In this case, the constraints are you're limited to a particular refugee camp, and you can only be the guardian until this child is resettled somewhere. There's also a note about the rationale, or how the guardian came to be a guardian. This particular one says that the guardian was self-appointed, and that's a very weak rationale or basis. If I'm presented with two guardians, one of whom is the natural parent and the other of whom was self-appointed, I think it's pretty clear which one has the stronger basis and the stronger argument in complicated situations. But even a self-appointed status is a legitimate status in some cases. If this child wandered into the camp and couldn't identify her parents, and no other guardian is found, at least a self-appointed guardian is participating carefully in the ecosystem. So anyway, rationale is present. And then the last thing that's worth calling out is that there is a link to trust framework information that tells what are the rules under which guardianship is defined, and should be what rules should be followed to protect this dependent. So this kind of leads to a follow-on question. If we have guardianship credentials, how do we use them? And the answer to that question is that we use them in what we would call guardianship challenges. Now, with ordinary verifiable credentials, there are moments when you get challenged for your credentials. When you're boarding a plane, there's the moment that you show your boarding pass. When you get pulled over by a policeman, there's the moment that you give the policeman your credit or your your credit card. You give the policeman your driver's license and your proof of insurance. When you enter a checkpoint at a national border, there's the moment that you show your passport. So in guardianship contexts, there are moments when a guardianship challenge is appropriate. The picture here is at a doctor's office, and perhaps there is a need to ask whether a parent is really the parent before approving a medical procedure or a vaccination or something. That would be a moment when a guardianship challenge is appropriate. There are lots of them. When you find a person with dementia and then somebody comes to the hospital to claim them and says, "I'm taking mom home now," that might be a moment when you need to challenge that person and prove that they're a guardian. And this guardianship challenge is like all other credential interactions. There is a verifier, and that is the person, and maybe multiple persons, who want to know whether guardianship applies. And then there is the guardian who is being asked to present proof on the basis of their credential.
All right, now we're going to transition to the topic of how do we govern this very, critically important process that Daniel just described some of the details of. That's the role of trust frameworks. Now, the term trust framework is the I think of it as the tighter, more a specific term that we in self-sovereign identity infrastructure, we use the more general term governance frameworks to talk about all of what needs to be governed. That term originated out of trust frameworks. I use them somewhat synonymously, but when it comes to guardianship, it is very clearly about digital trust. So we tend to talk specifically about trust frameworks. Now, trust frameworks for guardianship are going to be some of the deepest and most important ones that we have out there. All verifiable credentials are generally going to operate under specific governance frameworks, but guardianship credentials are going to have some of the deepest legal and social underpinnings. In many cases, they will be based on governmental laws, the ultimate governance framework. And they will apply legally binding rules and policies for that particular jurisdiction. And they do vary quite a bit by jurisdictions. That's one of the things that the Governance Task Force spent quite a bit of time, and we'll talk about the white paper that they produced in a minute. But the different regimes around the world and the way they handle guardianship relationships and dependence, there's a lot of difference in the law. So most guardianship trust frameworks will be tied into a jurisdictional underpinning. Then they need to address all the different phases of the guardianship life cycle. And every guardianship relationship has a complete life cycle. So, and they have to talk about business, legal, and technical processes that are necessary to mitigate the different risks of guardianship, which that white paper goes into some detail about. And most importantly, as I said, the second core principle of the sovereign governance framework is a dependent's right to guardianship. Part of that right is that if a dependent is in a situation where they can become independent, for example, a refugee that moves from a country where they're unable to assert and use self-sovereign identity to another country where eventually they migrate and they are able to do that, the credentials and wallets that a guardian or guardians have maintained for that refugee should now be able to be literally cryptographically turned over to the control of that refugee, and they can now become independent. So it's a very important right that needs to be recognized and facilitated by the governance frameworks. There's a sample guardianship trust framework that Daniel and the Guardianship Task Force created to illustrate specifically how this can work. Daniel, do you want to say a few words about that? The link at the bottom.
Yeah, if you go read this trust framework, you'll find that it's about 2 pages of written text, maybe 3. It's not a massively complicated document, but it answers some key questions. And I think there's a slide right after this that kind of enumerates what those questions are. The key thing that you need to think about when you're building a trust framework like this is, how can we clarify the rules so that everybody does the right thing? And the bullet points here are not necessarily an exhaustive list, but they're pretty close. These are the kind of vital questions that that determine whether your rules are going to work. You need to know where the where the trust framework is valid, and what kind of rationales for guardians are going to be recognized, and what kinds of permissions guardians could possibly have, what kind of limits you expect all the parties who do guardianship challenges to enforce, and what auditing mechanisms and so forth. I won't go through the whole list, but writing a trust framework for guardianship need not be a super daunting task. You could probably come up with a good first cut if you're an expert in the problem domain in a few hours. It probably wouldn't be perfect, and you would need to refine it, but it would be a good start on the rules of the road. And so I encourage you, if you feel like guardianship is relevant to your problem domain, to sit down and just spend a few minutes answering some of these kinds of questions, and or to also reach out to other parties and see if somebody's already started on such a thing. In the case of refugee camps, for example, if you're in that space, but you think there might be some other people that are already thinking about it, collaborate together. You want a guardianship framework, a trust framework, that as many people in your space as possible agree to use. And there's not any particular technical characteristics in the trust framework. They're largely, technology takes a back seat to kind of the human dimension that you're trying to spell out.
Absolutely. In the chat, Phil has pointed out that if you think about a health use case in England, a parent can be a guardian for a new baby, and both will have an NHS number where they need to record vaccinations, screening tests, and they're recorded in separate records, and a process for guardianship to end when the child becomes an adult and will take control of those records, or a transition if a child's adopted by another person or guardian. And that's a perfect example of the kinds of things that need to be taken into account for a digital trust framework for guardianship for parent-child relationships in the UK. All right, we want to close here with some examples of how guardianship is being used today. These are all from represent members, participants, contributors to the Guardianship Task Force at the Sovereign Foundation, because that's who drove this work forward. Guardianship is not an abstract concept. It is something that is desperately needed in certain parts of the world. The first one we'll mention, iRespond. The founder of iRespond, Peter Simpson, is one of the founding sovereign trustees. He's been working in the area of privacy preserving biometrics for over a decade. And he's not, I don't believe, here today with us on the call, because he's in Myanmar and Thailand working, boots on the street, with using, again, biometrics to help refugees in northern Thailand access essential health services. There is, if folks are aware, there's a long-standing camp of refugees stuck between Thailand and Myanmar that it's over 30 years of being without a country, without a sovereign country, and yet so entire generation of kids babies and kids have been born and are growing up there without official legal identity, and yet they need access to health services and other governmental services, and that's one of the missions of iRespond. Now, out of their work and the growing capability now of digital guardianship, they are partnering now, and there's going to be what they have told us is more information is coming soon, I believe in January, on the first project for guardianship of newborns that will be implemented here in Thailand and Myanmar, but then it's designed to be something that can be used anywhere around the world. Infant parent guardianship, as we've covered, is a very, very broad problem. And so you need to have a way of identifying, in a relatively strong way, using a privacy-respecting biometric an infant, and associating that with information about the birth, about the parental relationships, in a way that can be, doesn't have to be, but can be independent of any particular government or jurisdiction. And this can serve many, many humanitarian use cases. So I believe we have, I can't view the entire list here, but if you have questions about this, and we have anyone from iRespond here during our Q&A period, they can perhaps tell you more about that. So that's one specific use case. The other one we'd like to highlight was the subject of the workshop I mentioned at the start of the webinar in Toronto recently, entirely on self-sovereign identity and guardianship as applied to dementia. Secours is a company formed that is focused entirely on that problem, and they were the ones that put on this conference. I personally learned more about this problem. It was a good solid 6 hours of basically experts, some from around the world, but many Canadian experts on this precise problem, and talking about just how large it's growing, how many dimensions it has, and how critical it is to be able to bring these new tools to those that have to care for those with dementia. And it's a very unique case because these are people that are still active in life, that can be, they can be responsible for many things in their life, and then there can be a transition or a situation where they're suddenly not able, they need a guardian desperately. And so it's a particularly stark example of where guardianship applies. We have a link for Secours. I know we have several folks from the Secours team that are here with us to help in the Q&A period. I want to wrap up by emphasizing that guardianship is a work in progress. As I said, we've just finished a year-long effort by the Guardianship Task Force at the Sovereign Foundation. And there are two major results of that work. The first one is that I'm actually, the page I'm gonna show you from this page here, very easy, sovereign.org guardianship. You can actually just, if you Google sovereign guardianship, you will go straight to this page. It has first the guardianship white paper. This is a 32-page white paper on all aspects of digital guardianship, produced by this working group, and it's one of the richest, deepest white papers I've ever been part of working on. It has contributions from all the members of the task force, and as I said, it goes deep into both the legal, technical, and business and social dimensions of guardianship. So I highly recommend it. The other outcome was the clear decision, unanimous decision by the Sovereign Board of Trustees, approved last week to officially launch the Guardianship Working Group. So it's graduating from task force to a full working group that will begin in January. And that working group will now take the incubation stage and move into full definitions, technical, legal, and business, for guardianship, trying to help build models and work with different constituencies around the world that need guardianship to instantiate it, to design and test guardianship credentials, to help develop guardianship trust frameworks, and to work with those who need it to prove it out in the real world. So this is an all-volunteer working group. It's open to anyone that has a genuine interest in participating in this work. There are a number of new, I think we've doubled the size of the number of people since it was announced at the Secours event 2 weeks ago. And so it's very easy on this page. You can just click the Join Us button and send in an indication of interest if you're interested in that work. So in conclusion, we just, I think the message is clear, and I want to reinforce, it's not just Daniel and myself, that this work is one of the most important things we believe we're doing at Evernym in the development of self-sovereign identity infrastructure. It is tremendously meaningful. At an internal summit that we had a few weeks ago, we were talking about the values of the company and the impact that we believe this can have, and guardianship is one of the highlights of the kind of difference that we believe self-sovereign identity can make in the world. And it is specifically the way that we will contribute to implementing the goal, the tagline of the Sovereign Foundation, which is identity for all. Identity that works for every person in the world, regardless of their capacity. So we hope that you join us in that endeavor, and we're thrilled to be working on this, and it will be an area of focus for us as long as we're working on this. Now, we want to thank everyone for coming, and again, especially if you have questions now, please put them. I see a couple appearing in the chat, but there's a Q&A button, and I think it's the bottom of your screen. And so hopefully questions are already queuing up in there. Before we go there, we want to make sure, in case you have to leave early, to wish everyone a very happy holidays. Daniel and I and Alex and the rest of the team felt this was a perfect webinar in the holiday spirit to do as our last webinar of 2019. So we'll take that thought into the Q&A period here. And I'm going to stop sharing so that Daniel and I can just talk with you as we go into Q&A. Let's see.
Yep, thanks, Drummond. And I do want to point out that we have a number of folks here from both iRespond and Secours, and those are the companies behind the refugee, newborn, and dementia use cases that Drummond pointed out. So if you have any questions about those, feel free to put them in the Q&A, and then hopefully one of those representatives can answer it. But we do have a few here. So the first one is for Drummond, and it is delegation and guardianship sound pretty similar. Can you give some examples of how they are different?
Yeah, I'm happy to, and Daniel can weigh in on that too, because it's a subject of constant discussion about where that line is. So first, I want to reinforce where the line is. If you have two entities that are both self-sovereign, meaning they have digital devices with digital wallets, whether immediately on their possession or in the cloud, but they control those digital wallets. They're able to be holders of digital credentials and assert those digital credentials. That's any relationship between them where one is giving responsibility, the other is delegation. So delegation requires two self-sovereign entities that have the full capacity. Again, I gave the example of organizational delegation. There are many others. You could have it within a family. A classic example that we use, and we actually built a model of this for the Department of Homeland Security in our early work on DIDs, is a parent and a family that has uses their smartphone as the digital key for their car. They can delegate to one of the, say, teenagers that's of driving age, and they can literally give a delegation credential the keys to the car to one of those kids, but they can also put constraints on the delegation credential, as in it only works at certain times of the day, or it only works within a geographic region. It's a way you can truly have, you know, smart keys. And they may have the ability to further delegate it. For instance, if they're parking in a garage and they need to give a digital key to a valet. So that's delegation, where all of the parties have that capability. Guardianship is required when you have, say, a young child where they don't have the capacity to do that, and the parent needs to be able to actually manage the digital wallet for the individual. The example's already been given of, as a child gets vaccinations and medical and then credentials of medical treatment from the day they're born, or even before that, on up until the age of majority. All of those would be managed by the parent or parents. You can have, you know, multiple guardians. And then when the child reaches that age of majority, and I see another question on this very point, well, what happens? How does the wallet get turned over to that individual? The short answer, and we're happy to go into it more deeply, we've contemplated this from the outset of the design of the infrastructure, is the underlying cryptographic keys that are literally shifted over to control of those keys to the dependent. And so all the credentials will keep working, but the underlying keys that were used are replaced by keys that are now in the wallet, now under the control of the dependent. So I'll stop there. Daniel, you might want to add more.
Just one brief thing. One thing that helps me kind of quickly sort a situation into dependency, or excuse me, delegation or guardianship, is to ask the question whether the thing we're talking about is task oriented. Delegation tends to be task oriented. Guardianship tends to be status oriented, meaning, you know, could you please do this thing for me? Could you please drive the car? Or here's your privilege to drive the car. That's a delegation thing. It's a specific task, whereas guardianship is not, could you please do this thing for your child? It's, could you please permanently have the status of doing whatever is necessary for the child? It's not task oriented.
Right.
Drummond,
Alex, go ahead.
this is Michael Cornyn. I just wanted to add that on the practical side where we implement, in our particular use case, I see delegation as both a credential and as a property of a guardianship credential. So for us, we have a guardianship credential that refers to the dementia patient as the dependent. And when that patient wanders and we have to delegate the welfare of our dependent to law enforcement, then we have a property in our guardianship credential, which makes that capable. And that guardianship credential then moves to law enforcement. And then anything that credential allows the guardian to do for the time of the emergency, then law enforcement has those same rights and privileges and obligations. And then when the patient is found, the delegation property is revoked and it goes back to being a normal guardianship credential. Now, that's the way I've assumed that I'm going to deal with this kind of temporary delegation. So it's like we just mentioned that it's a task-oriented thing. The task is to find a lost person. But I don't know if there's a separate the delegation credential. Is there a separate delegation credential that we need to think about too? Or is it just always a property of some other credential? That's my question.
Well, I believe delegation credential is a separate class of credential that's needed. We have to dive deeper into that use case to understand what the relationship of those credentials is. But that's my set. Daniel?
If you think about a parent asking a grandparent, let's say that mom and grandma are sitting around the kitchen table at 3:30 one afternoon, and mom says, "Oh, I was going to run Sally down and register her to be on the softball team. Grandma, could you please do it for me? I don't have time. Here, I'll write you a little note saying that you're allowed to sign her up." That is a perfect example of a delegation. The mother is a guardian, and she's not turning the grandmother into a guardian when she asks the grandmother to do this task. She's taking some of her guardian privileges and delegating them to the grandmother who is not a guardian. And so the digital equivalent of that would be issuing a delegation credential that doesn't make the new holder a guardian, rather it makes them a delegate of the guardian.
Okay.
Yep. That's a good
And so that delegation credential is necessarily going to be a very limited credential.
Right.
It's not anywhere close to as complex as the
Yes.
guardianship. Okay.
Right.
Yes. It's
All
very
right.
narrow. Exactly.
By the way, the thing that determines how much of this can be done and what the rules are is the trust framework we were talking about. So if your guardian trust framework says a guardian can transfer all of their privileges to a delegate, but only for a limited amount of time, that's one possible thing it could say. Or it could say, no, it must be very granular and very limited because we don't want high-powered delegates. It's not safe in our environment. Those are different positions that a trust framework could take, and it just depends on your circumstances what is appropriate.
Okay.
So we do have a lot of questions here, so I'll try to move through these, but the next one could be for iRespond or really any of you. Have any of you handled a situation with low to no network connectivity, and how does that work?
That's an excellent question. It is one that I want to say right away is been an iRespond requirement in the work they're doing, which often happens out in jungles that do not have network connectivity. As a broad statement, SSI infrastructure needs to be able to operate without full network connectivity. I don't know, Daniel, how much you want to go into any more details about that, or leave it at that.
Well, I'll just say that using credentials without network connectivity is a partially studied problem. We know that there are some ways that caching can be brought to bear, and the trust framework needs to specify what kind of freshness must apply to data when it's evaluated, and it might give different answers for different kinds of circumstances. It might say, for example, in a refugee camp, enrolling a child in school can be done with cached data that's 6 months old. So you could be offline for a long time and enroll kids in school, but taking a child out of a refugee camp is a high-risk operation. You have to be online to check the currency of the credentials when you do that, or else you just simply can't take them out of the camp.
Yep.
That's perfect. So this next one is all about security, and it relates to SSI in general. But banks, governments, and universities are being hacked. How can we be sure that our identities will not be hacked?
Can I respond to that one, Alex?
Yep, please do.
There is a white paper on the Sovereign website called "What Happens If I Lose My Phone?" And the subtext is, if you lose your phone, there's a lot of hacking badness that could happen on that phone. So even though it's talking about losing a phone, it's really talking about the hacking problem. It's a long, detailed paper, and I recommend that you read it. The short answer is there are many layered protections that prevent your identity from being hacked. One of the most important ones in an SSI sense is that your identity is not in a treasure trove somewhere. Unlike the cases that we've seen with a giant Yahoo breach where there's 500 million or a billion accounts sitting there, and if the hackers can just get through the outer defenses, they have everything. In an SSI world, if the hacker gets through all the defenses, they've accomplished one identity hack. And now if they want the next identity hack, they have to start all over from ground zero and do the second one. So there's a 500 million to 1 difference in the incentives. But there are many other layered protections as well. And in addition, SSI offers many recovery stories that are not possible in an ordinary identity ecosystem. And the net is, I think there's a wonderful answer to that question, but it's way too much detail to go into on this webinar. So read the paper, and I invite you, if you're interested, to reach out to me in person, and I'll talk to you more about it in detail. It's a great question and super important.
Yep.
Excellent. And I did drop the link in the chat so you can find it there. This next one, Drummond kind of covered it, but we have a few similar questions. So I'll try and combine them. So one of the constraints is around time. And this relates to children that can come of age, get adopted, or go through a custody change because of divorce. And this question is specifically about healthcare in England with the NHS, but it could apply to most countries probably. And it is, a parent can be a guardian for a new baby and both will have a NHS number. What happens to these numbers through a transition if a child is adopted by another person?
Well, I'm not a specialist in the NHS system in the UK, but the general idea is the same regardless. Those numbers are assigned to individuals, and that would be part of a, for instance, a verifiable credential from the NHS to that individual, assigning them an NHS number. I see also the question that's come up. Well, these wallets, the wallet for the parent, the wallet for the child, they're both assigned NHS numbers. Do those go in the same wallet for a guardian or in different wallets? The technical answer is it can be accomplished either way. We strongly recommend different wallets because it just keeps the logical separation, makes it easy to manage what are pool or you don't want to commingle the data or the credentials of the guardian and the dependent. So that credential of that NHS number go in the child's wallet. The guardian is in control of that wallet, of actions of accepting credentials in or presenting that until that child reaches one of these life events that would cause it to change. Now, in the case of the child reaches the age of majority, what happens is the guardian is actually turning control of that wallet over to that to the child. And I see the question asked, well, how does that actually work cryptographically? The answer is the guardian controls the public keys that others can use to verify that they're interacting with that wallet. The guardian, and only the guardian, can turn around and say, okay, I'm now going to replace those public keys with public keys given to me by the dependent. Now, there is no way you can enforce cryptographically that you can say that's happened, but it has to be the dependent generating those new public keys and the guardian saying, I am now of my own volition going to replace the public keys I've been using with the public keys that belong to that dependent. The moment that happens, the guardian is no longer, not only no longer a guardian, they no longer have any control of that wallet. They have replaced the keys that prove anything from that wallet with public keys that only the dependent now controls, and the dependent is now independent. So that applies to how the dependent can graduate. It also applies when guardianship changes. One guardian needs to be able to revoke the or have their guardianship credentials revoked, and another guardian, for instance, one parent, if rights are transferred to another parent, guardianship credentials revoked for the first and invoked for the second.
Implicit in the idea of using credentials to prove guardianship is a feature that comes with credentials, which is revocation. So if a guardian transfers the wallet, one other thing that would likely happen is that their status in their credential itself would be revoked, meaning that they could no longer take that credential and go prove to somebody that they're the guardian anymore. And this actually gets to another question that Jan asked, how do attributes get updated? Attributes in credentials get updated by issuing replacement credentials, right? If your driver's license has to be updated so you have a new mailing address, you issue an update to the driver's license and revoke the old version of the credential. So the same thing is true of guardianship status itself. A government agency that appointed somebody to be a guardian could revoke that credential and issue a new one appointing somebody else to be the guardian.
Perfect. So we do have a hard stop at the top of the hour, but we have a lot of really, really good questions here. So we will answer these offline and send them in a group email so that we can all benefit from the answers. But I'll do one more, and it looks like this one is for Secours. So the question is, my dad had dementia. My sister and I obtained legal and medical power of attorney while he was still able to sign contracts. We had no trouble using these documents later when he lost a cognizant function. My point is that the existing system works pretty well. So why do I need SSI for this? What makes it a need to have instead of a nice to have?
What, you want to answer that, Michael, or shall I?
You can start while I think about an answer.
I know we have to go quickly here. So the first thing that comes to mind is ease of friction when you're doing this. So you carry that piece of paper, you now carry it electronically, and you're able to convey that document quicker and more efficiently to law enforcement or to the health facility. A lot more ease than having to, possibly carry that piece of paper in your purse wherever you go and have it verified that way. With the SSI, the credentials are verified similar to the court seal that would be on that power of attorney. They're verified electronically. So it once again is a means to verify quickly and efficiently. I think that's the big thing.
And I would add that the medical, or that the document, the paper document, is not as secure as a cryptographic document. You can forge a paper document. Forgers do it all day long, but you can't forge a cryptographic document.
Love it. Well said. And with that, we are out of time, but Daniel, Drummond, do you have any parting words?
I knew that Q&A would go quite deep, and I'm frustrated that the number of questions I see that I would love to keep discussing the answers to. So I just want to say we are very happy to continue to try and answer questions or have a follow-on webinar to go deeper into the subject. I thank everyone for coming, and I'm just really glad you're as interested in the topic of guardianship as we are.
I would just add that my email address is daniel.hardman@evernym.com, and I'd love to have somebody reach out to me if you have questions you want to discuss.
Yes, and mine's drummond.reed@evernym.com. So feel free to do the same thing. And again, I strongly encourage, please take a look at the Guardianship white paper, the Sovereign Foundation Guardianship page. And if you're really interested, please consider joining the Guardianship working group there, where you'll be working side by side to help us solve this challenge.